So thanks, everyone, for coming. My name is George Hamblen. I'm a senior QA architect for UST Global. For those that aren't familiar with UST Global, we're a large system integrator company. We do a lot of services work. We're about 30,000 people altogether, spread worldwide. We're headquartered in California, and we have a lot of folks working offshore and nearshore as well. Our topic today is unmasking data and the case for synthetic test data. I realize it might not be the most exciting thing to talk about right after lunch, but hopefully we can get rock and rolling as we go here. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit of a story that got started here. Before working for a consulting company, I spent over 30 years in the QA space working for different companies, a lot in the financial services sector and whatnot. And when I started in this business back in the last century, I was 6 foot tall and had a great set of hair. But after working in QA for a while, it definitely takes some health issues. So as I was pulling together the talk for the day, I started to reflect back in my tenure in the business, because you realize that data is such an important part of everything you do in testing. And what I really started to get a chuckle about is everybody says, well, let's put the data into spreadsheets. I said, that's really great. But when I started, I was working in the spreadsheet business. I was working on Lotus 123. Show of hands if you've heard of Lotus 123. Impressive. Yeah, 123 was actually our core product, and at one point, Lotus owned over 90% of the spreadsheet market. Well, let's just say we no longer excel at that, if you will. So that was like my first thought on the topic. And then I went to the financial services sector. And we were working on a trading platform, and this trading platform was going to be the first Windows-based platform that also tied in the internet. But we had a problem with data, and that is we had to find a way to get data from a portfolio off the DOS product and into the Windows product. And at that time, we didn't have an easy way to do it. So we actually called up one of our investors, and we said, hey, do you mind if we use your portfolio in our testing? They said, not at all. Just bring it in on floppy disks, and we'll go from there. So this guy shows up at our door, very unassuming guy, wearing like a fishing cap, really casual. And he has what I think is a lunchbox with him. He opens up his lunchbox, and he pulls out a floppy disk, and he pulls out another one, and he pulls out 5, and he pulls out another 10, and we're just kind of like looking. It's like, this is all your portfolio? So we were able to take in all of his data, and we did take his portfolio, and everything worked. But the entire time thinking, what am I doing wrong that this guy has 20 floppy disks worth of portfolio, and I can fit everything I own in mutual funds and stocks on a 3x5 index card? But the point being that this was an incredible amount of data, and that's the way we had to do it back then. Well, last thing I wanted to mention on the data front before we get rolling here is I worked for a bank for a while, and you had a lot of data that we needed for the bank. In order to do the testing, we actually had to fill out a form for the testing with what we wanted. And that group, the test data management group, had a 10-day SLA from when the request went out to when we could actually get the data back to work with it. And it's like, oh my goodness, there has to be a better way. And so after working on different project companies, I took a job with another systems integrator, and we were trying to bring ideas to the market. And he says, would you be interested in doing some research on test data tools? And I just smiled and say, boy, do I have a story for you. And that's like our starting point for today. So what we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the history of test data, how it's morphed over time, and the importance of test data, and talk about how the different solutions have come up over time, and talk about what I call the synthetic test data breakthrough, talk about how we work with test data going forward, and then open up to questions and answers. So in the brief history of test data, so in the early days, to talk about the spreadsheet analogy, we actually did put our numbers into our spreadsheet, and then we were able to work it that way. So that was like the starting point. I know a lot of people have been using spreadsheets over time. We also used macros. We used spreadsheet macros to create the data, and that gave us some data flexibility. And then, from there, we were able to do some rudimentary automation to create the data. And lastly, back in the good old days, when you could use production test data, we actually able to use production data to do our testing, just like the guy that we brought in when I was at the financial services company. But things change. Things become more complicated. And you can no longer just simply create data and expect that data to work. And also, data became a lot more involved in like mainframes and systems, and you had to go more end to end. So to that end, the key word, and the word you're going to hear a lot today, is referential integrity. In other words, how do I keep the relationships with the data that I can take it from end to end, from say login all the way through the back end systems out to where I get that data. As these systems became more complicated, you can no longer simply just go out there and just grab the data and have it work or create the data. So some new solutions had to come into place. So people started to put data provisioning teams in place. It's like, okay, well that sort of works a little bit, but then as things become complicated, then you realize those time hits become a lot longer. Having the right kinds of data, like even when you grab production data, there's still a potential problem that you don't have everything you need to test. So there still has to be some way to cover that gap. Financial services, for those of you that work in the financial services sector, you know that there are certain households that you need to get, or certain securities that you need to get, or insurance, or that sort of thing. All that ties together. And then once you use that data becomes burnt. It's no longer good to you unless you reset that data. And then if you have a bunch of testers working, well, you got to be careful that you don't clobber each other if you're all going after the same data, which is why test data management as a whole is a really, really important thing to take into play. The performance testing and the automation, they use huge amounts of data, and you got to be able to get enough data in place to handle all that. And then lastly, there's the privacy concerns, because after a while, when people started to realize you can no longer use private data, then you need to come up with some kind of solutions. So life itself was starting to become a little bit more complicated. So they started to come up with some other things. The original go-around with synthetic test data started to happen, and there were some positive things, but the reality was none of these tools were able to really easily able to keep the referential integrity that you needed in order to go with end-to-end testing. So people then decided to go, let's do some mask data. And as you'll find, that mask data for a lot of people has kind of become the de facto standard for things. The other side of the coin is, well, the provisioning teams went into place. And with provisioning teams, the issue there was it just simply takes a long time. And then you need to factor all that in. And the problem is you can't take a long time with data if you're going to work in an Agile DevOps model. It's just not going to work. So you need to constantly find solutions in order to satisfy being able to do testing. You don't want to be the shows up at the scrum and says, hey, I'm ready to go. Oh, but I don't have the data. Just give me 10 days. I'll be right back. You just can't do that. So like almost overnight, it seemed like masked data became the way to go. It's simply go take a production snapshot, then you go mask the data or obscure it, and then you're able to put it back into the system. But there were some problems there. These schemes, these masking schemes, were extremely difficult to put together originally because you needed people that were good at databases, people that could come up with a scheme. And then, by the way, when all was said and done, somebody still had a key to get back to your production data. So you're always at a little bit of risk or a little bit of exposure if you go with a masking scheme. Even if you use some of the tools that are out in the marketplace today, there's always somebody that knows or somebody that can get back to that production data. Another problem was, some of the data just might simply not exist. So you still have a gap in that scenario. Where it's like, yeah, I got all my data ready to go, but hey, I got another problem. It's like I don't have something to cover test cases X, Y, and Z. So something else still needs to happen in that case. And then, just the overall privacy issues like we touched on before. It's like you still have some exposure there. So masking has been good for a lot of people, and a lot of businesses you talk to or a lot of people within IT organizations, they have this notion that the only way I can test is with production masked data. They just don't hear it otherwise. There's this myth out there that says that's the only way I can test with data and be comfortable. Well, I got news for you. It's a new world, and things are changing rapidly. And synthetic data, what we're going to talk about today, kind of changes this equation and puts it on its head. I'm going to talk a little bit now about test data management and our approach to it. Because basically, this is a talk about synthetic data. But I also want to make sure it comes across that we're not just simply talking about synthetic data, because synthetic data is really part of an overall solution for when it comes to handling test data with an organization. For example, when we look at test data management, we have to think of not only synthetic data, but we got to look at mass data. We need a way to provision, maybe copy the data sets. You need to be able to go through and figure out what data ranges that you need to bring into place and figure out who gets the data and how to protect others from running over it. You need to subset certain sections of it. All kinds of things that need to be taken into consideration. So when we look at test data management, we're in the USD Global hat. It's like we need to take all this into consideration. But 9 times out of 10, it comes back to, can you mask our data? Can you give us synthetic data? But it's just important that you realize that it's an overall management process that we take forward. So when we break things down, we talk about provisioning archival components and being able to refresh environments and stuff like that. So it's a key part of it. You also need to protect the data ranges. So a lot of times you have a situation where you have to come up with a range and lock the range and lock other users from coming down. But when it comes to provisioning itself, we essentially take 2 approaches as an organization, again, depending on the need of the client. Whereas, we have the live approach where we go after, the actual, production data. We'll take a snapshot of it, or what we call a subset of it. We'll put it through the masking scheme. We'll do a quick validation of it. Then you run it through your validation engine, and then you do whatever it takes to move that data, into the test environment. So that's one approach. With a synthetic approach, it's a little different. Instead of having to take the snapshot of what's going on in production, we actually put together the schemes for what that synthetic data is going to look like, and then we take it through a very similar process. But now things are going to move a lot quicker. You'll be able to, to move that data, accordingly to the different levels, and then if you need to, you can snap it up again, maybe change things up, whereas you don't have that kind of flexibility. Now, for a lot of organizations trying to get the cell and synthetic data, you're still going to run into the mass data scenario, which is why we still offer both solutions, because sometimes you just can't win that argument, no matter how hard you try. So one of the things we do is we've got strong relationships with many different vendors in the tool space. It's just part of being able to work with clients, because clients will sometimes have their own tools and stuff. So we're also constantly evaluating tools and see where things can go. In the test data space, the big guys are Optum, which is the IBM product, Informatica CA, which is now owned by Broadcom, Delphix, and GenRocket. So these products up front, Optum, Informatica, CA, extremely expensive products. None of which really do synthetic data, but they're great for masking. And companies are really comfortable with them because they're the big names. Like, well, I brought in IBM. Well, that's great. It doesn't mean IBM is going to solve your problem, but at least you can say that you're using IBM. The same thing with CA and some of these others. Great names, but there's a ton of work behind them, and they're extremely expensive. Oh, and none of them really do synthetic data as well. But just to let you know that there are other players out there. We're going to focus in really today is a tool called GenRocket, which is a true synthetic product that provides fit-for-purpose data and can handle multiple scenarios, and we'll hop into that in a minute. So I'm talking about the synthetic test data breakthrough now, because I've given a bit of the history and talked about how synthetic data started to stumble little things. When we came across this product called GenRocket, GenRocket was a product that was envisioned by a guy that worked for a large financial services company, and was upset because he never had the right data. So he actually got into his garage and just started working on something that would solve his data problem, because he was a developer by nature. But he couldn't get data. His testers couldn't get data, so I said there has to be a better solution. So literally, just like a garage band, he hopped in his garage and he put together this whole scheme, worked on it for about 4 years, and has really produced something that's very special and very unique in about 1/10 the price of your IBMs and your CAs and the other things. So what exactly does GenRocket do for you? Well, first of all, it's an enterprise-level synthetic data generator. So you can bring into a large company, and you can deal all the synthetic stuff we talked about. They've got the only patented referential integrity scheme in the marketplace. In other words, they can go end-to-end with their synthetic data. I can get other ways they can take the pictures. I see a lot of cameras going up. The slide deck will be available afterwards too, but the important thing is the synthetic data is now you can keep that integrity. If you're going end to end, absolutely critical, and that's really what makes this a game changer. You can literally generate thousands of rows of data in less than 100 milliseconds, and you can actually, if you needed it, you can generate 1 billion rows of data in less than 20, 25 minutes if you have the right machines in place. You can do a query. So for the folks that insist on doing some kind of mass data, you can actually combine the power of synthetic data with their ability to query production data, and then take that production data, mix it with the synthetic data with a masking scheme, and now you've got something that's a combination of synthetic and production data, and that sometimes will help solve the remedy of if you need someone someone will only let you use mass data. You can take that combination into place. For GDPR or any of your privacy concerns, you can now use that synthetic data without ever exposing your actual data that you have, your production data. Never gets exposed because you're not technically looking at it, because you're doing everything behind the scenes by using a bunch of different screens and a bunch of different applications. So even when you're going for the mass production data, there's no exposure ever to the customer data, which is another big game changer. And then if that's not enough, they've got an API that you can leverage. So if you have some special data needs or something's just not being solved, you can actually go after it. Like these other tools that don't have the API, you can actually manipulate what you're going to go after and take it forward. So when I look at all these things, this is what makes this product a game changer. And they have a challenge out there. And I'll mention it to you guys too if you want to look at the product afterwards. They've solved every single problem that's ever been tossed at them. So if anyone here has a good test data scenario that they think can't be solved, take them up on their challenge. See if they can solve your problems. By the way, they do POCs free of cost too, so it makes it even more better. So in diving into the tool, there's just a few things that you need to know about it. When you look at data, they start at the domain level, which is the highest possible level, when you look at your database structure. Then it comes down to attributes. So like name, address, SSN, that sort of stuff. So you can set up the attributes. But the real strength of the tool itself are these things called generators and receivers. So what a generator does is essentially it grabs these different attributes, like say like name and address. And so what it is, it's like they have a group of names that have already been figured out amongst different countries, that sort of stuff. And they have the addresses and the other points, and they'll take things like credit card numbers. And what you do is you take these pieces and you move them around and you tie them together the same way that you would tie together your actual data. So instead of having to go do a big profile of your database or do discovery, as long as you know what your data is supposed to look like, you can move these components around and you combine that when you run it, and then that gives you your name and your address and your credit card number and all this stuff, and they're all random. It never touches any of your data, and that's what ties these things together for you. So right now, they have 247 of these generators. So anything can possibly dream up, chances are they already have it. If they don't have it, then they'll go off and create it for you because they realize it's going to be valuable to other customers as well. So from the generator, it actually goes into something called the receiver. And the receiver is what actually takes that data that's coming up and it'll morph it into whatever your target data is going to be. So if you want a CSV format, if you need JSON, SQL, DB2, you name it. They've got over 50 different types of database constructs that can be tossed out there. Lastly, it comes down to the scenario, and the scenario is how you define how many bits of data you want, how many rows of data you want. The beauty is when it's all said and done, you have data ready to go, and it just needs to be copied and then put into whatever database you want to. And then if you're doing multiple projects, you can just keep running this over and over again until you get everything that you need. So the concept is simple, but it's also extremely powerful, which is why they're starting to win these large contracts with a lot of well-known financial services houses, because they're doing all this while keeping their referential integrity and those other pieces together. And it's very easy to use. A lot of these other tools, you need to be more than a DBA to figure it out. You need to really understand the tool. You really need to really think about it, and you really need to tie things together. This is amazingly simple to use, and it's very quick to come up to speed on. So when you start off, there's a project dashboard. So just to kind of highlight a couple things, you put your projects, you pick them up here. When you put together your domains, you pull together your scenarios here. So this is where you would drive all your work. So if you needed to add some additional domains, you just click on new domain, another window pops up, and you put in your domain. If you need to put in different scenarios, you can put the different scenarios into place. And so you can basically run everything off this dashboard. And the way the system works, you could either do it on-premise or you can do it in the cloud as well. So they've got options there. Point is, you drive it all from this one database. So a good generator example here is we just need to do a flexible database range or date range. So it's a year, month, date format. You pick a start date. You pick your starting and ending ranges. So it gives you an idea how far you want your range to run. You put the jump amount, like how often that you want to skip, and say if you want to do 1 year, 2 year, that sort of thing, you do that. It's going to go by year, and it's going to randomize the dates, and it's going to randomize by the month and date. So when you execute this, the data would look something like that. So very quickly you get your year, your month, and everything else. It's all random and ready to go. And this literally takes less than a second to run. But when the strength is when you combine these generators, now you have them all linked together, and now it's spitting out all your data very quickly, and you're good to go. Now the receiver side, what this one looks like is basically it takes your domain account, and then in this particular case, it's going to generate SQL, and these are the different receivers that it's got running with it, and then it's got all its parameters given. So again, the system is very much a keyed-in system. You move these parts around, and the best thing is if data ever changes or the way your scheme works, you just go back to the original set of generators and you just rearrange them all, and you're able to start again. So where we use this thing? So from our perspective, we can tie this into database testing, unit testing, functional testing, automation testing. There's multiple scenarios. You can put XML, you can use JSON. There's the SQL component if you want to put in a database. You can hit the microservices level, or if you need to do any custom work, you're capable of doing that as well. So this is how it ties in to things like CI/CD or Agile and DevOps, because now you're going at lightning quick speed. You can make whatever changes you need to make on the fly, and it can support all these different components. So, you can tie into Jenkins, Selenium, or whatever commercial testing tool that you're using. It's good everywhere. This is why they put the challenge there. It's like, give us a problem we can't solve. Because as of yesterday, they've solved every single one. So the way we've approached it is, again, looking at our test data as a whole, like a management perspective. There's two ways we've approached this. There's the masking level, which is the top visual there, which takes you, from your production data through the modeling and the masking, and then we can put that into premium test data packs, if you will. So we have the ability to move multiple test data packs around. Whereas on the synthetic side, we actually put together an on-demand dashboard that ties into GenRocket, so people can then make their own queries. And then we can put those into different databases, and we can move them around. to support the individual releases. So that model that I had back at the bank, where it would take 10 days to generate the data, that's gone now. And I can do this in less than an hour once I get everything figured out. And it becomes really handy, especially if you're supporting Agile or something else where you need the data. You can use this and be off to the races. Okay, this eye chart you see before you talks about some of the different scenarios that we've been able to use GenRocket in. So in the first case here, we're working with a telemedicine type company that had a situation where they needed to be able to do performance testing and load testing. So what we were able to do is we were able to come up with a model that we were able to generate enough data to support the performance testing and the other components. At the same time, convert this data into SQL because it was needed for SQL. And it also helped on the regression side because now we're able to provide the data that was needed for regression. It was repeatable data, and we actually drove down the amount of time that the regression testing was actually taking. So not only did we get the additional data that was needed, but we're also able to get a side benefit of improving the overall regression test time. We had a health insurance company that had a problem. They just simply needed a test data management organization to come in and be able to put all their test data management components together. So we essentially put together a team that could do the masking, because the masking was required, but also set it up for the synthetic data, so we're able to switch as needed for the organization and be able to meet their needs. And then lastly, we had a UK investment management company that we were able to create enough data. They had a problem where they had the production data that they needed to bring in. So what we did was we came up with a scheme that could take the synthetic data and augment that with the production data. It goes back to what I talked about earlier about mixing mass data with the synthetic data and being able to move forward and be able to handle all the testing. Because as you know, you have to keep going back to the well when you're doing the performance and your load testing. These are just some examples. Every day, it seems like we're doing something new. Yeah.
Does that mean you would layer two of those products together? So you would take maybe a Delphix for your masking and then overlay the GenRocket?
GenRocket would do both of it. Both of it. It's not really.
That slide that you showed, where you had GenRocket with the synthetic on top, the masking that you showed on top, was that also GenRocket or was that something else?
No, the previous example was actually, that was a different tool. Yeah, because we were able to go back and forth. The thing about using GenRocket as mass data, it does it, but it's one of those things they don't really like to talk about because they're all about the synthetic data, but they also realize that a lot of companies won't move with a test data product if it doesn't do masking. So they do masking. They actually do it better than a lot of others because you have that synthetic mass data combination to take forward. To answer your question, that was two different examples. Good catch. Any other questions? Sorry.
Does GenRocket have a generator for a USB show?
Like location, that sort of stuff? Or yeah, they do. They do. And if they don't have it, they'll create it. So where have we used it and how have we used it? So we touched upon that a little bit. Automation, performance testing, and those other components. And for us, being a large company, health insurance, medical, retail, supply chain, logistics, retail, we've used it in all these different areas going forward. The newest thing is we're getting involved in AI and machine learning, and we're starting to develop schemes to support AI and machine learning as well. Something else that they've started to do is that they've put together data packs for organizations. So if you work in like the medical or the health claim space, they've actually put together products that are ready to go off the shelf that work in the EDI format. For those that work with EDI, they actually have data ready to go. So you don't even need to do the synthetic side of it because they have these components ready to go. That is a little bit more pricey than just using the product itself. So what are the advantages? It's realistic data. It's fit for purpose data. It keeps the referential integrity, and you never never expose any of your customer data out, because you can do all that stuff without touching forward on it.
Can you expand on that? How does it keep that referential?
Yeah. So what it does is, for each of the, as you move those components around with the generator, that keeps the relationship in place. And so when you generate the data, then that relationship is kept in place as you move forward. So if something changes on your data, then you can go back, move a generator around, and reposition it with the other data, kick it off again, and then you have your next set of data. So then you're able to go end to end with the data going forward. And then you can use any format. There's an endless amount of different types of data that's out there. The SQL, JSON, CSV, all those others. It's capable of producing that for your organization, which is also a huge win. And again, there's the privacy components as well. Thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it.